The crackling radio transmission cut through the humid air of the Pacific Theater like a knife. Japanese intelligence officers hunched over their equipment, frantically scribbling down the strange sounds emanating from American military channels. They had broken dozens of codes before, deciphered countless encrypted messages, but this was different. The sounds weren't random noise or standard military encryption. They were words, clearly spoken words, but in a language unlike anything they had ever encountered. In a dimly lit bunker somewhere in Tokyo, Lieutenant Commander Yoshida pressed his headphones tighter against his ears, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had spent 15 years studying languages, had cracked British, Dutch, and even some American codes. But this was impossible. The syllables flowed together in patterns that defied every linguistic rule he knew. There were no cognates with English, no familiar grammatical structures, no phonetic patterns that matched any known language in their extensive databases. "Play it again," he commanded his subordinate, his voice tight with frustration. The recording played once more. The voice was clear, confident, speaking at a normal conversational pace. But the words might as well have been from another planet. Yoshida had heard rumors from the field that the Americans were using some new unbreakable code, but he had dismissed them as battlefield mythology. Every code could be broken. It was simply a matter of time, resources, and intelligence. He was wrong. Thousands of miles away, on a beach in the Solomon Islands, a young Navajo man named Samuel Holliday crouched in a foxhole, his radio pressed against his mouth. Bullets whizzed overhead as Japanese forces mounted another assault on their position. The din of war surrounded him, explosions shaking the earth, but his voice remained steady as he transmitted crucial coordinates to nearby artillery units. He wasn't speaking in code. He was speaking in Diné Bizard, the Navajo language, the tongue his grandmother had taught him in the red desert mesas of Arizona, the same language that government officials had tried to beat out of him at boarding school just a few years earlier. Now, that very language was saving American lives. "Diba, Ana Azzo, Tlagin, Ajad, Moasi, Lin, Yehez," he spoke rapidly into the transmitter. To anyone listening, it sounded like an exotic foreign language. To the artillery commander 2 miles away, another Navajo code talker, it was crystal clear. Sheep, potato, turkey, leg, cat, horse, itch. But those weren't random words. They were coordinates, spelled out letter by letter using the Navajo code, DESTROY. Within minutes, American artillery rained down on Japanese positions with devastating accuracy. The enemy forces, who had been preparing to overrun the Marine position, scattered under the barrage. Samuel allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before the next transmission came through, requesting his position to coordinate a supply drop. The story of how the Navajo language became America's secret weapon began not on a battlefield, but in a Los Angeles living room in 1942. Philip Johnston, a civil engineer and the son of missionaries who had grown up on the Navajo reservation, sat reading the newspaper. The article detailed yet another American code that had been broken by Japanese cryptographers. The Japanese were exceptionally skilled at code breaking, their intelligence officers having studied at the best universities in Europe and America. They had broken every code the Americans threw at them, sometimes within hours. Johnston set down his newspaper and thought about his childhood, about the Navajo families who had taken him in, taught him their language, their ways. He remembered how complex the language was, how it had taken him years to become conversationally fluent, and even then he knew he would never speak it like a native. An idea began to form, one that seemed almost too simple to work. The next morning he contacted the Marine Corps. His proposal was met with skepticism. Use a Native American language as a code? It had been tried in World War I with limited success using Choctaw and other tribal languages, but those efforts had been informal, unstructured. Johnston proposed something different. He wanted to create a formal code based on the Navajo language, one that would be impossible to break without knowledge of both the language and the code itself. The Marine Corps agreed to a demonstration. In May 1942, Johnston brought 4 Navajos to Camp Elliott in California. Under controlled conditions, they demonstrated that they could encode, transmit, and decode a 3-line English message in 20 seconds. The same message took trained cryptographers 30 minutes using the existing military code machines. The Marine officers watching were stunned, but speed wasn't the only advantage. Major General Clayton Vogel, the commanding general, understood something more profound. The Navajo language itself was the code. There were no Navajo grammars published in English or Japanese, no Rosetta Stone to unlock its secrets. The language had never been written down in a standardized form. Outside of the Navajo Nation and a handful of missionaries and traders, almost no one in the world spoke it. And most importantly, no Navajo people lived in Japan or the Pacific Theater. The Japanese had no way to access native speakers for interrogation or study. The decision was made. The Marine Corps authorized the recruitment of 30 Navajo men for a pilot program. They would become the first class of code talkers, though that term wouldn't be used until much later. At the time, they were simply Marines with a special skill. The recruitment process was unlike anything the military had attempted before. Recruiters traveled to the Navajo Nation, to remote hogans scattered across the high desert of New Mexico and Arizona. They were looking for men who were fluent in both Navajo and English, physically fit for Marine service, and between the ages of 17 and 35. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Many of these young men had been punished in government boarding schools for speaking their native language, had been told that their culture was primitive and needed to be erased. Now that same government desperately needed their language to win a war. In Window Rock, Arizona, a young man named Chester Nez heard about the recruitment. He was 19 years old, slight of build, but tough from a childhood spent herding sheep in the unforgiving desert. He had dreamed of leaving the reservation, of seeing the world beyond the red rocks and endless sky. But he had also experienced the casual racism of border towns, the contempt with which many whites treated Navajos. The military, he knew, would be no different in many ways, yet something about this opportunity called to him. His language, the language his grandfather spoke, the language of the holy people, could become a weapon against tyranny. He walked into the recruitment office and signed up. The first 29 recruits, Chester among them, reported to boot camp in San Diego in May 1942. They were scattered among regular Marine units for basic training, and the experience was brutal. The Navajos were called every slur imaginable, treated as less than human by some drill instructors and fellow recruits. Many had never been far from home before, had never seen an ocean, had never experienced the rigid hierarchy of military life. Some wanted to quit, but they endured, driven by pride and a sense of sacred duty. After boot camp, the code talkers were brought together for the first time as a unit at Camp Elliott. Here, in a heavily guarded classroom, they would create something that had never existed before, a military code based entirely on the Navajo language. They were given a seemingly impossible task. They needed to create a vocabulary that could encode English military terms that had no equivalent in Navajo. How do you say bomber in a language created by people who had never seen an airplane? How do you encode amphibious assault in a tongue that came from the desert? The solution they devised was brilliant in its simplicity. They would use Navajo words as metaphors. A bomber became Jay-Sho, which meant buzzard in English. A fighter plane was Dahetihi, a hummingbird. Bombs were eggs dropped by birds. Ships became different types of fish. A battleship was Lotso, a whale. A destroyer was Carlo, a shark. A submarine, moving unseen beneath the waves, became Beshlo, an iron fish. For the alphabet, they created a list of Navajo words whose first letter in English corresponded to the letter they needed to spell. A was Wullachi, an ant. B was Shush, a bear. C was Moasi, a cat. But they went further. Recognizing that common letters like E and T would appear frequently and create patterns that could be exploited, They created alternate words for the most common letters. E could be ant, elk, or I. T could be turkey, tea, or tooth. This added another layer of complexity that would frustrate any attempt at frequency analysis. Within weeks of completing their training, the first Navajo code talkers were shipped out to the Pacific Theater. The year was 1942, and the war was not going well for the Americans. The Japanese Empire had swept across the Pacific with terrifying efficiency, conquering the Philippines, Singapore, and vast stretches of territory. Their military codes were sophisticated, and their code breakers were even better. Every American military communication seemed to be an open book to Japanese intelligence. Until now. Chester Nez found himself on a transport ship heading toward Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The Marines were preparing for their first major offensive operation in the Pacific, and Chester and his fellow code talkers would be tested in actual combat for the first time. As the island came into view, covered in dense jungle and wreathed in morning mist, Chester felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't training anymore. This was war. The landing was chaos. Japanese artillery pounded the beaches, and machine gun fire raked the incoming landing craft. Chester and another code talker named William McCabe scrambled off their boat and dove for cover behind a fallen palm tree. Around them, Marines were shouting orders, screaming in pain, calling for medics. But, through it all, Chester's radio crackled to life. He pressed the receiver to his ear and heard Navajo words cutting through the noise of battle. The message was urgent. Japanese forces were massing for a counterattack on the left flank. Artillery support was needed immediately. Chester grabbed his transmitter and began speaking rapidly in Navajo, encoding the coordinates, the number of enemy troops, the urgency of the situation. His voice was steady, trained, professional. Within 2 minutes, the message had been relayed through the chain of command, decoded, and acted upon. American artillery began pounding the Japanese positions before they could launch their attack. A nearby Marine officer stared at Chester in amazement. He had never heard anything like it. The transmission had been fast, clear, and apparently effective, but most importantly, it had been completely incomprehensible. If the officer couldn't understand it, the Japanese certainly couldn't either. On the other side of the island, Japanese intelligence officers were having a very bad day. They had intercepted the American transmissions and recorded them. The tapes were played over and over, analyzed by their best linguists and code breakers. Nothing made sense. The language wasn't English, it wasn't any Pacific Island language they knew, and it certainly wasn't any code they had encountered before. One intelligence officer thought it might be a Native American language, but which one? There were hundreds of Native American tribes, each with their own language, or dialect. And even if they identified the language, how could they learn it? Where would they find a native speaker willing to help them? The battle for Guadalcanal raged for 6 months. It was brutal, grinding warfare in the worst possible conditions. The jungle was suffocating, the heat unbearable, disease rampant. Men died from malaria and dysentery as often as from Japanese bullets. Through it all, 15 Navajo code talkers worked around the clock, transmitting thousands of messages. Not a single message was misunderstood or decoded by the enemy. The speed and accuracy of their work became legendary among the Marines. Major General Alexander Vandergrift, the commanding officer at Guadalcanal, sent a report back to Washington. In it, he praised the code talkers in the highest terms. Their work, he said, had been flawless under the most extreme conditions. He requested more code talkers be recruited and sent to the Pacific immediately. The code was working even better than anyone had dared hope. The success at Guadalcanal led to an expansion of the program. By 1943, recruitment efforts intensified across the Navajo Nation. More young men signed up, drawn by duty, adventure, and the knowledge that their language was proving invaluable. The original 29 code talkers became instructors, teaching the code to new recruits. The vocabulary expanded as the war progressed, adding new terms for new weapons and tactics. Eventually, more than 400 Navajo men would serve as code talkers. But their work came at a cost. The code talkers were in constant danger, not just from enemy fire but from their own side. In the confusion of battle, with Japanese soldiers sometimes speaking English to give false orders, many American troops were suspicious of anyone who didn't look white. Several code talkers were nearly shot by their own men who mistook them for Japanese soldiers. To protect them, code talkers were often assigned bodyguards, Marines whose job was to keep them safe and, if necessary, to prevent them from being captured alive. The code could not fall into enemy hands. In November 1943, Marines launched an assault on Tarawa, a tiny atoll in the Gilbert Islands. The Japanese had turned it into a fortress, with concrete bunkers, heavy artillery, and nearly 5,000 troops sworn to fight to the death. The Marine commanders knew the battle would be costly. What they needed was perfect communication, instant coordination between units, and absolute secrecy. They needed the code talkers. 6 Navajo code talkers landed with the assault waves at Tarawa. The battle was even more horrific than anticipated. The landing craft got stuck on coral reefs hundreds of yards from shore, forcing Marines to wade through chest-deep water while Japanese machine guns tore them apart. Bodies floated in the surf. The beach was a killing ground. But through the carnage, the code talkers kept working. They called in airstrikes, coordinated artillery fire, relayed casualty reports, and directed reinforcements. They worked from shell craters and behind the burned-out hulks of landing vehicles, their radios often soaked with seawater and blood. One code talker, Jimmy King, worked for 36 hours straight during the Battle of Tarawa. He transmitted over 200 messages without a single error. When the battle finally ended after 76 hours of hell, American casualties were staggering, but the island was taken, and military analysts later concluded that without the rapid, secure communications provided by the code talkers, the battle might have been lost entirely. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, frustration was mounting. Japanese cryptographers had devoted enormous resources to breaking the mysterious American code. They tried frequency analysis, pattern recognition, linguistic comparison with dozens of languages. Nothing worked. The sounds didn't match any known language family. There were no repeated patterns to exploit. It was as if the Americans had invented an entirely new language just for the war. In desperation, the Japanese military command authorized an unusual mission. They would try to capture a code talker alive. If they could interrogate a native speaker, perhaps they could unlock the secret. Special units were briefed to watch for radio operators who looked different from other Americans, to try to take them prisoner rather than kill them. But the code talkers were too valuable and too well protected. Every attempt failed. There was one moment when the Japanese thought they had succeeded. Early in the war, before the code talker program began, several Navajo soldiers had been stationed in the Philippines. When the islands fell, one of these men, Joe Kiyumiya, was taken prisoner. He wasn't a code talker, he had never been trained in the code, but he spoke Navajo fluently. The Japanese discovered his background and brought him to their intelligence headquarters. They played him recordings of code talker transmissions and demanded that he translate them. Joe listened to the recordings and understood nothing. The words were Navajo, but they made no sense in context. He heard words like turtle, eagle, and whale being used in strange combinations. He didn't know that these words were code for tanks, planes, and ships. He tried to explain that while he understood the individual words, the overall meaning was incomprehensible. The Japanese didn't believe him. They thought he was lying, refusing to cooperate. They beat him savagely and tortured him, but he couldn't tell them what he didn't know. Eventually, they gave up, concluding that even a Navajo speaker couldn't break the code without knowing the system behind it. They had been defeated by the ingenuity of the 29 original code talkers, who had created something truly unbreakable. Нет, это примерно половина. Продолжаю историю дальше. By 1944, the code talkers had become an indispensable part of Marine operations. Every major assault in the Pacific now included Navajo communicators. Their reputation had spread throughout the Corps, and commanders who had once been skeptical now specifically requested code talkers for their units. The program had expanded far beyond the original 29. Over 400 Navajo men had been trained and deployed across the Pacific Theater. The invasion of Saipan in June 1944 would test the code talkers like never before. The island was heavily fortified, with 30,000 Japanese troops determined to fight to the last man. The American plan called for a massive amphibious assault involving over 70,000 Marines and Army troops. Coordination would be critical, and any breakdown in communications could result in disaster. 6 code talkers were assigned to the operation, working in shifts around the clock. The battle began before dawn on June 15th. The naval bombardment was deafening, thousands of shells screaming overhead to pound Japanese positions. When the landing craft hit the beaches, they were met with withering fire. Japanese artillery had survived the bombardment and now rained death on the exposed Marines. In the chaos, conventional military radios were overwhelmed and several were destroyed by enemy fire. But the code talkers kept working. Thomas B. Gay crouched in a shell crater, his hands moving rapidly over his radio controls. He could hear the urgency in the voice of the code talker at battalion headquarters. Japanese tanks were moving toward a gap in the American lines. Coordinates flowed in rapid Navajo, each word precise, each syllable crucial. Thomas translated the message, relayed it to the commanding officer beside him, then transmitted the response. Within minutes, American tanks were moving to intercept, and the Japanese advance was stopped. For 3 weeks, the battle raged across Saipan. The code talkers worked without rest, transmitting hundreds of messages each day. They called in airstrikes, coordinated artillery barrages, directed troop movements, and relayed intelligence reports. The speed of their communications gave American commanders a decisive advantage. They could react to changing battlefield conditions faster than the Japanese could adapt. Major General Holland Smith, the commanding general, later stated that without the Navajo code talkers, the Marines would never have taken Saipan. But the cost was terrible. Thousands of Americans died, and the Navajo Marines were not spared. Several code talkers were wounded. One was killed by artillery fire while transmitting coordinates. His last words, spoken in Navajo, were a plea for medical support for wounded Marines pinned down by Japanese machine guns. The support arrived, but too late to save him. As the war continued, Japanese desperation grew. They knew the Americans were using some form of unbreakable code, and their inability to crack it was costing them battles and lives. In late 1944, Japanese intelligence made one final, desperate attempt. They brought together every linguist, cryptographer, and codebreaker they could find. They played recordings of code talker transmissions and analyzed them using every technique known to modern cryptography. They searched their archives for any information about Native American languages. They even tried to recruit Japanese linguists who had studied in America, hoping they might have encountered Native American languages during their time there. Nothing worked. The sounds remained impenetrable. One Japanese officer, in a report that survived the war, wrote in frustration that the American code appeared to be based on a language that does not exist in the known world. He was closer to the truth than he realized. The Navajo language was so different from any Indo-European or Asian language that Japanese cryptographers had no frame of reference to even begin analysis. The grammar was unlike anything they knew. The sounds were produced in ways that Japanese speakers couldn't easily reproduce, and the code itself, layered on top of the language, created a double encryption that was mathematically impossible to break without the key. February 1945 brought the ultimate test. The Marines were preparing to invade Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island that the Japanese had turned into a fortress. The Japanese commander had dug miles of tunnels, positioned artillery in concrete bunkers, and prepared his troops for a fight to the death. American intelligence estimated that taking the island would cost at least 15,000 casualties. The code talkers would be vital to the operation. 5 code talkers landed with the first wave on February 19th. Thomas B. Gay was among them. wading through volcanic ash that was like quicksand, pulling at his boots with every step. Japanese artillery fire was murderous, shells exploding all around, throwing up geysers of black sand and shrapnel. Thomas dove behind a small rise and immediately began setting up his radio. Bullets snapped through the air above his head, but his training took over. His hands were steady as he established communication with the command ship offshore. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days and became one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. The code talkers worked from foxholes and shell craters, from captured bunkers and destroyed pillboxes. They worked under constant artillery fire, through mortar barrages and banzai charges. They transmitted more than 800 messages during the battle, every single one delivered accurately and without error. Major Howard Connor, the signal officer at Iwo Jima, later said that if it weren't for the Navajo code talkers, the Marines would never have taken the island. The iconic photograph of Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of American determination. But few people knew that at the moment that flag was raised, a Navajo code talker was transmitting the news back to command. The message was simple, spoken in Navajo: sheep, uncle, ice, bear, ant, cat, horse, itch, dog. To anyone listening, it was gibberish. To another code talker, it spelled out Suribachi. In the final months of the war, as American forces prepared for the invasion of Okinawa and potentially Japan itself, the code talkers continued their work. They had become so proficient that they could encode and transmit complex military orders in seconds. Their accuracy rate remained perfect. Not a single message had been misinterpreted or intercepted in 3 years of combat. The code had proven absolutely unbreakable. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, and Japan finally surrendered, the code talkers had transmitted thousands of messages across dozens of battles. They had participated in every major marine operation in the Pacific. They had been at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They had worked under the most extreme conditions imaginable and had never failed. But when the war ended and the Marines came home, the code talkers returned to a different reality. The program remained classified. They were forbidden from talking about their service, even to their families. While other veterans were celebrated and honored, the code talkers were silent, sworn to secrecy. The code might be needed again, the military said. It had to remain secret. Chester Nez returned to the Navajo Nation and tried to resume his life. He got a job, started a family, and tried to forget the war. But it was hard. He had nightmares about the battles, about friends who had died beside him, about the weight of responsibility he had carried, and he couldn't talk about any of it. When people asked what he had done in the war, he could only say he had been a radio man. The full truth had to remain hidden. For decades, the code talkers lived with their secret. Many struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Some turned to alcohol. Others withdrew from society. They had saved countless American lives, had helped win the war in the Pacific, but they couldn't tell anyone. Their language, the language they had been punished for speaking as children, had proven invaluable to America. But America couldn't acknowledge it. Finally, in 1968, the code was declassified. The military had decided it would never be used again, and the code talkers were released from their oath of silence. For the first time in more than 20 years, they could talk about what they had done. The response was overwhelming. Historians wanted to interview them. Schools wanted them to speak. The media discovered their story and was amazed that such an incredible tale had remained hidden for so long. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th as National Navajo Code Talkers Day. It was the first official recognition of their service. Many of the original 29 were still alive to see it, including Chester Nez. He stood with his fellow code talkers, now old men, as they were finally honored for their contributions to the war effort. But it wasn't until 2001 that the code talkers received their highest honor. President George W. Bush presented congressional gold medals to the surviving members of the original 29 and congressional silver medals to the other code talkers. The ceremony was emotional. These men, now in their 70s and 80s, had waited nearly 60 years for recognition. Some wept openly. Others stood stoically, as they had been trained to do in the Marines. Chester Nez accepted his medal with quiet dignity. He thought about his grandmother, who had taught him the language. He thought about the boarding school teachers who had tried to beat it out of him. He thought about his fellow code talkers, many of whom hadn't lived to see this day. And he thought about the irony of it all. The language that America had tried to destroy had saved America. The Navajo Code remains the only military code in modern history that was never broken by an enemy. Military historians and cryptographers have studied it and concluded that it was effectively unbreakable. The combination of an unknown language and an innovative code created a level of security that even modern computers would struggle to crack. The Japanese, despite their sophistication and resources, never came close to understanding it. Today there are monuments to the code talkers on the Navajo Nation and at military bases across the country. Their story is taught in schools. Books have been written about them, movies made. But for many years they lived in obscurity, carrying their secret in silence. They were warriors who fought with words instead of bullets, and their weapon was more powerful than any gun. The last of the original 29 code talkers, Chester Nez, died in 2014 at the age of 93. In his later years, he spoke often about his experience, about the pride he felt in using his language to serve his country. He talked about the other code talkers, about their courage and sacrifice. And he talked about the Navajo language itself, about how it had survived centuries of suppression and had proven its value when it mattered most. The code talker's story is more than a tale of wartime ingenuity. It's a story about the resilience of indigenous culture, about how something that was considered primitive and worthless by the dominant culture proved to be invaluable. It's a story about young men who took something that had been used to punish them and turned it into a weapon to defend freedom. It's a story about language as power, as identity, as survival. The Japanese never knew what hit them. They intercepted thousands of transmissions, recorded them, analyzed them, and threw their best minds at the problem. They never came close to breaking the code. They didn't know they were listening to the Navajo language, didn't know that the language itself was the key to the encryption. They were defeated not by superior technology or overwhelming force, but by the words of people they would never meet, speaking a language they would never understand. In the end, the Navajo code talkers proved something profound, that indigenous languages and cultures, far from being obstacles to progress, held unique value that couldn't be found anywhere else. The language that government officials had tried to erase became the language that helped win a war. The young men who had been told their culture was inferior became heroes who saved thousands of lives. Their legacy endures in the Navajo Nation, where the language they use so skillfully continues to be spoken, taught, and cherished. Every word spoken in Navajo today carries the echo of those code talkers, young men who stood on beaches and in jungles, speaking the words their ancestors had given them, turning language into victory, turning suppression into triumph, turning pain into pride.